Good morning and welcome to this demo. Today we're going to be looking at how we can set up the starter application that includes Crs Schema and Crs binding. And so by the end of this application you should be able to set up a basic view like this that is schema driven, so created via a JSON file, and also has binding enabled. So for example, if I update this input, you can see that binding kicks in and updates the corresponding text as well. So let's go and look at how we can do that. So if you head on over to Cape Raven repos and you look for Crs application schema template, you will come to this page where you can use this template, and then you can give your repo a name, give it a description, decide whether it's public or private, and then click this create repo from template function or button, sorry. And what that's gonna do is generate a repo on your side, which is generated from kbraven/Crs application template. So I've called mine schema setup, and as you can see from the README, it's exactly the same as the Crs application schema template repo. Right, so that's step one. The next step that we need to do is then, if you haven't done so already, we're going to go and clone Crs Schema also from Cape Raven to our local machine. Right, so once you have it cloned, we're going to open that up within a code editor, and you can also open up your template that you've generated on your side. So here you can see here's my schema setup template application that I've generated from Crs application starter. And here is Crs Schema itself. And so because we're not using Node within the template, we need to run the bundle on Crs Schema in order to create this dist file with these files here, so that we can bring Crs Schema into our application, our starter application. So once you've run the bundle, you'll create this dist directory with these files in it, and all you can do is just copy these files and paste it in your starter application under the packages. So when you first create this thing, you'll only have Crs binding, Crs modules, Crs router, and then you can go and create Crs schema and bring those 4 files into that directory. So that's all we need from Crs schema. You can close that once you're done, and then let's look at how we can then go and set up Crs schema. Right, so if we open up the index.html file and you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll come to the script which is importing a whole bunch of stuff. So we're importing Crs binding, modules, Crs router, and then we need to import a kind of a init file or a setup file which is going to set up Crs schema. I've stuck mine under bootstrap and called it boot Crs schema. But essentially the purpose of this file, which we're going to talk about in a moment, is to set up Crs schema. So yeah, just import that file, and then also any custom components that you have, you need to bring into this array here. So when you first create this template, you should have this initial entry of my component, but any further components that you create, any custom components, you need to bring into this array. So you can see here I've got bindable form and my group. These are 2 custom components that I've created that I want to enable binding on. Right, with that being said, let's go and take a look at our Crs schema setup file. So as I mentioned, the purpose of this file is to set up Crs schema. So I've got this create schema loader, or I import this create schema loader and HTML parser both from Crs schema. And then once you've imported those 2 things, the next thing that we need to do is any schema providers, and I'm not going to go into detail of what a schema provider is, I've got a separate video on that. Any schema providers that we have, we want to import them also within this file and add them to a global object. So I'm calling my global object, or setting it as global_this.schema, and then I've got another object within this called providers, where I'm defining this map-like structure where I have a key and I'm just pointing it to any of these, or to the corresponding provider that I've imported, right? So once you've done all of that, then we come down here and we need to create this create HTML parser function. So what this guy is going to do is it's going to go and call those 2 functions that we've imported up here and create us a HTML parser. And then we're going to go and loop through our providers that we've defined and register any of those providers onto our manager. And then we need the setup variable manager. So if you're working with schema variables, again, I've got a separate video on what schema variables are. But if you're working with the schema variables, we need to also create the setup variable manager function and hand it the parser that we've just created up here. So hand it the parser, and what this guy's going to do is it's going to overwrite, we're going to fetch the variables manager off the parser, and we're going to overwrite the process function on the variable manager, and it takes a value and a key, and we're just going to do a whole bunch of checks to say, okay, does the value have at data model, or is it an expression, is it a binding attribute? You can see here, so I've got all these functions, these helper functions to find underneath. If any of these are true, then we're going to call this prefix expression function, which just swaps out. If the value has an at, it's going to swap out that at with schema.variables. Otherwise, it's just going to return the value. Right. And once you've done all of that, that's our parser kind of setup. So we're just going to return the manager or the parser. And then you can come down here and we can create the setup parser function, and we're going to also set it on the same kind of global object. So global list.schema. And then we're going to set .parser is equal to, and we're going to call that create HTML parser function that we just spoke about now. And then we're just going to call that setup parser function. Right. So that is Crs Schema set up. Just remember to import it in your index.html. Right. So I'm not going to go into detail on the schema providers. I've got a separate video going into that topic. What we are going to look at is setting up the views. So under app, we've got all these different directories, and these are corresponding to, if we head back to the application, all of these different views here. Right. So if we just go and look at this guy again, so if we open up the roots, I'm just going to drag it across here. You can see here's our different roots for the different views that we want in our application. So we've got the welcome screen, we've got the form, we've got the about, and here's our basic schema example. We just set a title, a hash, a view, and you can see it follows a similar naming convention throughout. And if your view has a CSS file associated with it, it's going to have this has style flag set to true. So that's what you need to do on roots. You just need to bring any of your views that you create into this roots array. And then you can go and create the corresponding directory. So under app, we have this basic schema, and this guy, the JavaScript and HTML have the same name as the directory name. And so it's following a bit of a convention. And so let's take a look at these guys. So firstly, the JavaScript file, all it does is it extends from the view base. So Crs binding the classes of view base, and it has this init view where it's going to go and grab this HTML, and all this HTML has is a simple div that contains this bindable form custom component with this data-schema attribute set, which is a path to the corresponding schema file, as you can see here, that is going to be associated with our view, right? So this is the schema file that we are using to generate the view that you see here, right? So it's going to go and, so we just need to define the path to that file. I've just put mine under the same directory. You might have a whole kind of directory set up for schemas that you want to call or whatever, but I just found it easy just to associate it within my view itself. Right, so we're going to call this init view on the JavaScript, and it's going to go and grab that bindable form. It's going to check if it's got that schema data attribute set on it. If it does, then we're going to go and fetch that schema using that path and pass that text result as JSON. And then we're going to hand that JSON to the bindable form and as a setter. So bindable form.schema is equal to that schema JSON. Right, so let's go and take a look at that custom component that's handling a lot of the heavy work for us, right? So Again, I'm just going to move this guy over here. Right, so here's our bindable form custom component. As you can see, it extends CRS binding.classes.bindable element because it is a bindable element that has binding attached. And so all this guy is just a simple div that has a class of form container on it. And that's just going to hold we're going to place our HTML equivalent of the schema within this form container. Right, so we have this init template on the connected callback, which we call, which similar to many other custom components, just fetches that HTML. Sets up a template, adds the HTML that we fetched to that template, and then appends that template to itself, essentially. Then we just have some more work where we create this details element property, which fetches that form container that we've mentioned here. And then we check if the schema property is set on the component. And if it is, then we want to go and call this refresh from schema function. Right? So what this guy's doing is, this is where we're calling that parser that we set up on global schema. So this parser that we set up over here, we call it over here to then go and parse the schema, the JSON, and that's going to return to us the corresponding HTML. And then we're going to check if our details element or that form container is set up and available. And if it is, then we're going to just set the inner HTML of that guy to the HTML that it was passed. And then we're also going to call CRS binding.parsers.parse element on the component itself and dispatch the event that it's ready once all of that is complete. So by that stage, the schema should have been processed and the binding should have kicked in, and so we can say, okay, cool, this component is then ready. And then just a comment on some other things that we've got here. So here you can see we've got a getter and a set on the schema. If at any point the schema changes, it's obviously going to come into this schema setup, and we are going to call the schema has changed function. And what this is going to do is it's going to clear the schema. So it's going to clear the contents of our custom component. And we're going to set the property of the schema, and then we're going to refresh from schema and run through the same sort of process again, where we then go and regenerate or redraw or repass the new schema content into HTML and so on. But yeah, that's essentially how you can set up a basic view or simple application with a basic view that is being run via JSON and has the binding enabled. I definitely encourage you to run through this process yourself. Go and use this template and create a template of your own. And you can refer to my repository series or schema setup, which has all the files that we just spoke about, like boot CRS schema file, which you then can refer to if you get stuck. But yeah, that is the demo on how to set up a simple starter application that has a JSON view and binding enabled. Thanks.